So, I want to introduce the next speaker. He is an up-and-comer on Twitter. Everyone should follow Fabian Gompf on Twitter. He's really good. And yeah, he's going to be talking about Polkadot and Substrate. So if you're curious about this, please join and listen. Welcome, Fabi. Let's give him a hand.
Yeah, thanks, Anna, for the intro. Yeah, follow me on Twitter. That's my handle. If you can't read it, it's Fabian, Gompf. It's quality content 24/7. You won't regret it. I want to use the next 20 to 30 minutes to give a bit of a Parity, like untypical talk, in the sense that I don't want to talk about tech and what we've built and how the inside looks. I think we've done it quite a bit over the last weeks and months in the context of Substrate and Polkadot. I rather want to talk about intentions. So why do we get up every morning at Parity, and why do we build exactly those two things and not something different? And I want to basically make two cases, kind of like outline the trends we see right now in the space. And okay, I've lost my signal. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about the trends we see in the space, and kind of want to make four cases and talk a little bit about how this maps into the technology stack we have and the design decisions we've made. So in particular, it's four cases. Like one, and they're kind of like building up, like building onto each other. So one is a case for like further diversification and specialization in blockchain technology. If you believe that there should be more specialized blockchains and more diversification, I think it's also easy to make a case that we should probably not start from scratch all the time. We should probably think about standardization, like reusing working tech, and kind of like coming up with building blocks to build those chains. So this is all what we're doing with Substrate. The other thing is Polkadot. So if you believe in a world where we should have all those different chains and we can actually build them easily and in a secure way, then I think it's also not so hard to understand that we want blockchain interoperability. We want some way for blockchain networks to be able to talk to each other and understand each other. And the fourth point is, and it's probably the least talked about, is if we have all that, we have all those different chains and they all talk to each other, then we also want to pool their security. That makes sense without interoperability, but it makes especially sense in the context of interoperability. All right, so before that, I want to talk a little bit about Substrate and Polkadot, just so we're all on the same page what that even is. So who here has heard of Polkadot and like thinks he has a rough understanding of what the capabilities are? Awesome. What about Substrate? Oh, that's pretty good. Okay, I can almost skip the next slide. I still want to untangle a little bit like some misconceptions that are going around, maybe also because of poor communication from our side, I don't know. So Polkadot is like a protocol we're working on in concert with the Web3 Foundation. It's really an open interoperability and pool security protocol. Substrate is a development framework, it's a software framework to build blockchain technologies from the ground up. It is much more of a kind of like Parity Technologies product in that sense. The relationship you can see here, I'm not sure how good you can actually see it, but it's like a Venn diagram. You have in the middle, you can build Polkadot parachains on Substrate. But you can also build Substrate chains that are not integrated into Polkadot. And you can build parachains on Polkadot that are not built on Substrate. But the two technologies just make a ton of sense together and are pretty powerful together. So those are kind of like the different ways of integrating substrate-based chains in Polkadot. On the very left, you see no integration, what's called solo chain here. It's basically a chain that's completely sovereign. It has its own consensus, and it just lives on its own. Bridge chains, Jutta was already mentioning that. Björn is going to give on Friday, I think, on the main stage at Devcon, a whole talk about the Parity bridge. It's kind of like the technology that on the basis of this is going to work on. But it's still, you're completely sovereign with your chain. You don't get the pooled security part of Polkadot, but you get the interoperability part. And Parachain is where you basically you're still sovereign over the state transition, but you give up the consensus and you plug into the Polkadot consensus. Okay, so now I want to start making my cases. It's a little bit unfortunate that we can't see that at all. It's basically like 3 steps back. It's the idea of how specialization and generalization usually stand in tension, and that's like all over engineering, right? You can, like, you know that like from software programming, like from like object-oriented programming, where you talk a lot about that. But really, that's true all over engineering. Like if you think about like actual physical tools, like for builders, like you can have a tool that's really specialized. That works for like one use case very well and is optimized for that, or you can have a tool that works on a lot of use cases, but just not as good, right? It's much more flexible. And if you look at the blockchain protocol engineering, I would argue we have right now like an engineering bias towards generalization. We see most projects want to build platforms. They want to build platforms like smart contract platforms where you have like, you want to have a DEX, you want to have a stable coin, you want to be a currency, you want to have like governance figured out. In the end, you want to make use of those networks effects and go like all the way flexible, and but not actually optimizing for anything in specific. So the most extreme case for optimizing in like a blockchain case would be something like a completely application-specific blockchain, and there are tons of reasons why you would like to do that. Like the performance reasons, where like maybe your VM is actually a bottleneck, and in a app-specific chain you can like actually have like a single app optimized state machine. There's security reasons where due to the complexity of the VM, you have a pretty big, like a pretty broad attack vector. There are reasons for like having a very sovereign chain. Like if you think about Ethereum, you're bound to Ethereum governance, so you're bound to what kind of EIPs core devs push forward, or you're dependent on what kind of research roadmap the Ethereum Foundation comes up with. If you build your dApp on that. And flexibility feeds into the same thing. You're bound to the general platform limitations. Obviously, if you have your own chain, you can much more customize that. So why is basically no one doing that? There are pretty much 2 reasons. One is network effects. And network effects is like, if you think about something like 0x or MakerDAO, there's tons of these like lower level building blocks on the Ethereum blockchain that like a lot of dApp developers can leverage. And if you would have your own chain, you would need to build all that from scratch. You can't plug into the data or the identity or all that stuff that's there. Obviously, if we have interoperability solutions, that's like it's not a silver bullet for that, but it definitely mitigates that quite a bit. I think there's still a place for platforms, simply because interoperability comes at a cost, like whether that's like latency or cross-chain transaction costs or something like that. There will always be platforms, but we can mitigate that to a very large degree with like with a proper interoperability network. And the second thing is engineering effort. So it's pretty hard to build a blockchain from scratch. God damn it. Nice. Yeah, it's pretty hard to build a blockchain from scratch. Like we see that, there are tons of examples. Whether you talk about kind of like cryptographic vulnerabilities in IOTA, or like broken BFT consensus in EOS or NEO, wrong usage of cryptography, let's put it that way, in Lisk. And the list goes on and on. It's like because people reinvent the wheel all the time. Like they reinvent the wheel over and over again. So our approach with Substrate is, can we not come up with a kind of like a rock solid basis, a substrate of peer-to-peer networking and pluggable consensus, and then on top of that, kind of like everything that's unique to your chain, everything that's part of your state machine, put into like modules and libraries where you can either write your own or like plug them together to actually have a unique chain. This is how we want to break out of the problem that you often have with software frameworks, where either it's like too flexible and you don't even know where to start, or it's too restrictive and you can't actually build what you want to build. So we've started to build a bunch of things on Substrate ourselves to like showcase and test how flexible this framework actually is. So one thing is a WASM-based smart contract platform. So this is a screenshot from a monitoring service we have. If you go on telemetry.polkadot.io, you can check that out. So it's a live test network of that we've built on top of Substrate. Another thing is, and Jutta was already mentioning that, Rob is actually going to talk about that on Friday at Devcon, is we've started a prototype, or built a prototype of the Shasper beacon chain on top of Substrate. We're also playing around with kind of like the Bitcoin UTXO model, and like you can go as far as not being bound to the actual data structure of blockchain. So we are playing or experimenting with building more of a DAG-like system on top of Substrate. Another thing we're building on Substrate, and now it gets a little bit meta, is Polkadot itself. So the relay chain of Polkadot is also being built with Substrate. This is again a screenshot of the monitoring service. You can use the same service because it has the same basis of Substrate, so the interfaces look the same. Yeah, again, we have a live test network that you can check out. So this was the Substrate part of things. So now that we've established if those things actually work and we can people can easily build secure blockchains, and we have a world with a lot of different chains that fulfill their niche and have their place in the ecosystem, then really what we want those chains to be able to talk to each other. And this is why we why we came up with Polkadot, why we spend so much time with Polkadot. This is not really Polkadot how it looks now. It's more of a Polkadot vision, or how we imagine maybe Polkadot to be in 2 or 3 years from now. You see in the very left, if you see anything, I don't know. It's a WASM-based, what I was talking about, like a WASM-based smart contract platform on Substrate. You see like a bridge to Ethereum 1.0. You see here a Zcash Parachain, like Jutta said, which is announced like a few hours ago. The cooperation with the Zcash Foundation to build the first non-Zcash company, Zcash implementation. You see here kind of like a layer down where you have where the relay chain has another relay chain as a parachain, and you get these like nested relay chains, and you end up with this tree structure of blockchains. And on the very bottom, you see like a kind of like an energy specific relay chain that has a bunch of like industry specific chains. This feeds into what I was saying, like interoperability, might actually be expensive, so you want to make sure, like locally, chains are close to each other that like communicate often to each other. Okay, so we're missing the last part of pooled security. So even if you're not talking about interoperability, securing a blockchain is pretty hard. So again, those are just a bunch of headlines of chains that got like 51% attacked, usually like double spends against exchanges or something like that. So this already happens quite frequently, and I'm sure like most people know that website, but it's a great website called crypto51.app. It basically lists like the cost to 51% attack, like a bunch of proof of work coins for 1 hour. And what you realize if you look at that, it's pretty damn cheap to do that. It's like surprisingly cheap, and that's due to the fact that like every time you spin up a new chain, you compete over the hashing power that is out there in the world. And if you believe in a world where we have lots of different chain and this diversification keeps going, then this will get worse and worse, right? We will have more and more chains that compete over these resources. That's not just true for proof of work, that's also true for proof of stake. There's just so many people who are willing to put down like value to be validators on those chains. Now, if we talk about interoperability, it gets it gets pretty interesting because if we have, I think it's best explained with like a simple example. If you have two chains that are interoperable with each other, so let's say there's just like a simple bridge deployed, and you can make a token transfer from like a less secure chain to a more secure chain, and the less secure chain, the transaction gets rewarded. There's like an attack or whatever. The cost of the transaction got rewarded, but the effect of this transaction, meaning like someone has more balance in their account, actually just moved on, and you run into inconsistencies. Like this is already pretty bad if you have like two chains, right? Like imagine having like a network of like hundreds of chains being interoperable, and you only connect them with those bridges. It gets messy pretty quickly. So really what you want to have is a network where they can all pool their security and like they all share the same security guarantees. Yeah, so where are we with all those things now? So with Substrate, we're like 10 or 11 months into the project. We're a few weeks out away from the first kind of like beta release. So all the stuff is already open source. You can check it out. We already have the first teams kind of like start hacking on Substrate and start building stuff. But with this beta release, this will come with like much improved kind of like developer experience and documentation in general. Polkadot, and we want to do like a 1.0 release of Substrate at some point beginning of next year. Polkadot, obviously, since it's built on Substrate, is a bit further out. Polkadot, we want to go live in like end of summer next year, roughly. So this was all pretty high level. If you want to dig deeper, there was the Web3 Summit last week in Berlin. There's a great talk by Gav. It's like half of a kind of like coding demo, half, I don't know, circus performance or something like that. It's definitely worth watching. It's basically him bashing on his keyboard and like demoing how to build on Substrate. There's also another like I think 2.5 workshop or something like that where Gav does like a whole like code level deep dive into Substrate. So if you wanna get deeper, that's definitely worth checking out. Thanks.
Hey, does anyone have any questions about what Fabi just talked about? Give you guys a second. I know it takes a while sometimes. Any questions? Do you have a question for yourself?
No, I just want to say like there are a bunch of like Polkadot and Substrate like core devs here also. Just like come find us and talk to us.
Cool. Oh.
And we are hiring. It's parity.io/jobs. Check it out.
Cool. Thank you.